Here is a brief recording summarizing the important information about academic strategies from chapters 6, 7, and 8. Remember, we did not look at every slide or every page in these chapters, but simply a few of the more important or impactful strategies were listed. Active reading is interacting with the content you read. In other words, not just reading a textbook with only your eyes, but interacting in some way as you read the textbook. So having some physical interaction with your reading is active reading. There are 3 steps for active reading. Prepare in advance, prepare to read. Read with focus, and review what you've just read. To prepare, you will need to preview the assigned reading. Look at the preface or introduction, the table of contents, the summary. Look for headings and key terms. And then identify purposeful reading questions. This strategy means creating questions you expect to answer once you've finished reading the chapter. You can create these questions out of the chapter's headings and key terms, and then you can use these questions as a study guide. Additional ways to do active reading are to annotate, which is just a fancy word for writing down or marking up your reading. You can use quick notes, you can draw symbols, you could write summaries in your own words, and you can write directly in your textbook if you have a hard copy book, or you could use things like Post-it notes or a notebook paper to annotate as you are reading. Highlighting and underlining are also active reading strategies. And of course, taking general notes as you are reading. Many students don't realize that you should take notes on your textbook reading, not just on your professor's lectures. So you're taking actual notes on the reading. As you are reading, a very powerful tool is to recite sections that you've just read, where you say what you've just read out loud or in your head. Many students say they start reading and then 20 minutes later they have no idea what they just read, or maybe an hour later and they've just wasted that time and they have to go back and reread. If you recite after reading each page or section of your chapter, you will not waste time because you'll know right away whether you understand and remember that information. If you can't say what you've just read out loud, then you know you need to go back and read that section, but you don't have to reread the whole chapter. As you're reading, you also will summarize and write down the main ideas, the central ideas. And then the last step of reading is to review. It would be very powerful to review with a study partner. Here's where you can find the answers or answer your purposeful reading questions that you made before you started reading. You could use those purposeful reading questions to make up your own practice tests or quizzes, and you could go over your reading with a friend or a classmate. Now we're going to look at the main points from Chapter 7 about note-taking. There are 4 steps to effective note-taking. Prepare, actively listen, watch, read, and participate. Step 3, record, which is just another way for saying taking notes. And step 4, similar to active reading, you want to review your notes. So with preparing, This is just where you gather the information and materials you'll need. If you are taking notes on your textbook reading, of course, you would have the book with you, or you may be taking notes in a class. And so, again, you would just have all the materials you need, maybe different colored pens, pencils, highlighters, your actual notebook, post-it notes, any of the materials you would need. When you are in a lecture, you're actively listening, watching, and participating. So while we can't eliminate all distractions, if we are in a lecture setting, we can try to reduce distractions, such as putting away our phone, or if we're studying at home in a Zoom setting, we can try to make the area where we're studying less cluttered. When you are taking notes in a lecture, you really need to paraphrase, which means restating the information in your own words. Please don't try to write down every single thing the professor says. It's impossible. So you need to be able to paraphrase, which means whatever the professor says, but restating it in your own words. And symbols and abbreviations are a great way to save time in your notes. You can use any symbols or abbreviations that work for you. Also, asking questions in class is a great way to make sure you are able to put your notes in your own words, whether you ask the question or listening to other students who ask questions. The fourth step is to review your notes. The best way to do this is to review your notes immediately after class or immediately after reading. So in other words, right after you take the notes, you want to review the notes. Then, if you remember from chapter 4, we talked about distributed studying. You'd be able to review your notes a little bit each day throughout the week or several times during the week. And that's a way to do distributed studying, but also reviewing your notes. When you are reviewing, you might realize that there are some parts of the notes that you don't necessarily understand or that you might have missed. So this is a good time to talk with classmates or your professor to find out if something's missing from your notes, or if you need to understand it a little better, to be able to paraphrase, which remember means putting your notes into your own words. There were several types of note-taking methods shown in this chapter, so I'll just quickly go through the types. And what's important is that you know about these different types in case one of these types of note-taking is more effective for you than another. So first we have outlines, which are very familiar for most students, where you're indicating different levels of information, higher and lower levels, and usually outlines use Roman numerals, letters, and or bullet points. There are pictures in your textbook and in the slideshow of each of these methods. The second method is called charting, where you make a chart with rows and columns to organize your notes. And you'd have the main topics on the left, features and details in the second and third column. This method works pretty well for people who like to see charts and pictures and think of themselves more as visual learners. The Cornell system is an excellent resource, probably the one I would recommend most highly. The Cornell system has you divide your page into 3 sections. You take notes on the right, then you put key words and key points in a Q column on the left, and then you do a summary of the notes in your own words at the bottom of the page. The Cornell system allows you to take notes and study, in other words, learn at the same time. So you don't have to take notes and then go back later and study. This system actually builds in studying as you're taking the notes. And you can see an example in the picture here. Again, you take your main notes on the right, then you bring keywords and phrases into the Q column on the left, and at the bottom, you write a summary in your own words. Can you imagine if you did these 3 steps for everything in your classes or your textbook, how powerful your learning would be? Again, this one is not just a note-taking system. The Cornell system is a learning system. Many people are familiar with mapping. The mapping method is also known as concept webs, or concept maps or webs. And this is where you have the main idea in the center and then you branch out with details. And here's an example. Chapter 8 covers memory, study techniques, and test taking. In Chapter 8, the process of memory is described. There are 3 steps in our memory processes. Encoding is the first step where we take in information. Storing, we store the information in our memory. And retrieving is where we pull the information back out of our memory, for example, on a quiz or a test. There are 3 levels of memory. The first is sensory memory, where we take in information through our 5 senses. This is very short. Sensory memory is fleeting memories. Only lasts for a few seconds at the most. If we concentrate on those senses, we can move the information into our short-term or working memory. This one is still limited, however, to 4 to 7 items and lasts only about 20 to 30 seconds. So we have to keep working on the memory to move the memory into our long-term memory. The capacity of our long-term memory is limitless, and this is where we have our memories, but this is also where we have our long-term learning, where you will remember facts and information from your classes if they are in long-term memory. This picture simply shows you how the process works. You take information in from your senses, for example, your sense of hearing or seeing, touching, maybe even smelling. You encode the information, meaning you start to think about it, you start to work on memorizing it by moving it to your short-term memory. But again, remember, short-term is limited, still only about 30 seconds. So we need to rehearse or study the information to keep encoding and moving the information into our long-term memory. Once it's in long-term memory, then we can retrieve the information. We can actually bring it back out of our brain, for example, on a test or a quiz. One of the ways we can bring information into our long-term memory is to use elaborative rehearsal. It's a fancy word, but all it means is associating new information with something you already know. Elaborative rehearsal, when you're learning something new, you connect that new information to information already in your memory, what you already know. You can do this in lots of ways, including reviewing your notes, answering purposeful reading questions, and doing self-testing with practice tests and quizzes. There are several memory tricks or mnemonics listed in this chapter. Again, mnemonic is a word that simply means a memory trick. And I know that many of you have used these already, you just maybe didn't know they had a fancy label. So an acronym is when you create a word with the first letter of each item to remember. Associations are where